There's lots of experimentation of ideas.
Yeah.
Interesting. So if somebody had enough money, they could go to a poor country and say, we want to buy some land from you. That would be a possibility. A country could sell its land.
They could, but that land would still be subject to all the normal laws of the country.
Why?
Because it's part of that country's sovereign territory.
What if that country sells its sovereign territory, though? Can it not do that?
Well, when people normally say buy land, they're talking about buying it in the same way that you bought this home, presumably.
No, I'm talking about someone rich enough to go to a country and say, I just want to buy that one island. I just want that. I'll give you 20 billion, whatever the price is, but we're claiming sovereignty over at that point. You can't, like, we're separating ourselves from you. We're going to establish our own country.
Well, typically there's a parliament and legal system, and you can't reverse sovereignty on any particular piece of land you've sold unless you go through the parliament.
But just imagine that scenario.
Okay, let's imagine it.
Yeah. Could you establish your own country?
You could, yes. There wouldn't be any reason for you to not be able to establish a country. Your obstacle would be whether this country is recognized by others.
Yeah.
So there are certain places that are seeking international recognition at the moment. One example is Liberland, which is...
Yeah, I've heard about this.
Yeah, an area between Serbia and Croatia where the river has moved, which normally marked the border between which previously marked the border between the countries. And because the river has moved, there is an area in the U-bend of the river, which is kind of ambiguous territory. It's not, people aren't sure whether it belongs to Serbia or Croatia. And so some people have come together and tried to claim this land. Their project is called Liberland, and they're seeking international recognition from other countries. And that has proved to be quite difficult because of the sensitivity around this particular piece of land.
Yeah.
There's a different view as to whether they're allowed to be there and allowed to establish the project, depending on whether you consult the Serbian or the Croatian government. So there's some sensitivities there. But that's one of the key things that you need to have in order normally to trade with other people, to have a passport that's accepted at other countries. If you want to visit other countries, it's international recognition.
Yeah. I mean, look, okay, it's pretty clear that to establish these free, independent private cities, whatever you want to call them, it needs to be within the structure of a open, willing government that's allowing it to happen. What types of governments do you think are most likely? Is it more developing countries because there's an economic incentive?
I would say that where we tend to focus our efforts is in developing countries, partly because they're a bit more open-minded and they're looking for solutions. And if you go to developed countries, it's typically harder because people tend to view politics through a slightly different lens. I would argue, in part, because maybe like some bad political ideas have started to become more popular in recent decades, and
such as what?
Well, so let's take this country as an example. I would argue that the reason why this country is so
fucked,
become so well, it's still one of the wealthiest countries of the world, is because we had a long period prior to the Second World War and the First World War where we did have a very different system of government, where government, again, the proportion of government activity was like less than 10% of GDP.
What are we at? We're like 40% now.
We're at about 50%.
Are we 50 now? It's ridiculous.
It's kind of gone up in the COVID response, and
I've talked about this on the show recently.
Down a little.
One of the things that was discussed recently with regards to inflation, the government was looking to remove 90,000 positions from within government. It's like, that's a lot of positions, and that was all new positions that were added within government in the last 4 years.
Since 2016 it was.
Was it 2016?
Mm-hmm.
So they wanted to remove 90,000, but they'd added a net 90,000 new people working for the government since 2016.
Okay. That must be public servants in general, right? So that includes doctors, nurses, teachers.
I don't know.
It's not
civil service jobs, it says.
Civil service.
Yeah.
But imagine how many of those have come just in the last 2 years because of COVID, or 2.5 years, whatever it is.
Yeah. That seems like an incredibly high number to me, because I think the total figure is about 420,000 civil servants in the UK. But
yeah. Well, 90,000 civil service jobs like to lose in an attempt to Boris Johnson find money to ease the cost of living crisis. I mean, look, it's. I saw it here, even in the US. There was like a report, like 60% of government spending is on government, or 60% of tax. What was it? We saw it recently.
I can't remember.
But I mean, the point is like these successful Western liberal democracies have the size of the state. It's just got out of hand. It's got too big.
And it takes a lot of time for if you accumulate capital over a long period of time. I don't know, when was this house built, just out of interest?
About a year ago.
About a year ago. Okay, so it's a new build house.
Yeah.
Well, like the area that I grew up in, in Gillingham, the houses there are normally built in the 1890s, most of them.
Right.
So that's kind of capital stock that you developed a long time ago, that you developed during the period of the gold standard, that you developed during a period when government spending was much lower, when there was lots of the things that we take for granted, like government funding of science, the NHS, all these things, like none of them existed.
Houses built with solid walls.
This house is built with solid walls.
I'm talking about the houses in Gillingham. They built in the 1890s.
Oh, yeah, they
all the walls will be
last.
solid.
Exactly, they are. They're good quality builds.
So I don't know if you saw. You might not have seen it. There's a whole estate that's just been built up around here. I got back from holiday 2 weeks ago. I went away for 2 weeks. The houses that are there now, you can see them, did not exist before I went. In 4 weeks, a whole row of houses just appeared.
Okay.
And I don't know if they started the day after and they finished the day before I got there, but like they've just propped up.
Okay. Well, there's nothing necessarily bad about that.
No, there is, because they're soulless, badly designed, badly built, shitty estates. They're terrible. The properties, like one of my friends moved into one of these similar estates, by the same company building them. The house, like after they moved in, the amount of problems they had with it just moving, the walls cracking. These are shit houses built very badly.
It's interesting because people often say that, like, if you had someone told me that roughly, like in Western societies, roughly half the housing stock or the building stock was built before the Second World War and roughly half afterwards. And if you ask anyone, would you prefer to keep all of the houses, all of the structures that were built before the Second World War or after, then they always say before, because these houses tend to be, or these buildings in general tend to be more aesthetically pleasing, built so they're longer to last. And this is the opposite of what you would what people that are supporters of the current urban planning system and land planning system would expect, because the whole argument for intervention in the housing market and for being very prescriptive about how houses should be built, what the size of the rooms needs to be in order for it to be a suitable dwelling, and there are lots of those that exist. All of these are designed to improve quality, but the result is that because you end up having to comply with all of these regulations to do with size and the shape of the housing and things like this, you add on extra costs, and then this means that in other areas you have to skimp in order to come down and be competitive with your pricing. So we find that actually the result is the opposite of being very prescriptive in.
Do you want me to tell you a really dumb regulation for this house?
Tell me.
So did you notice the wheelchair ramp on the way in?
Yeah, I did.
So that's waiting to be removed. So this house could only be signed off once it had a wheelchair ramp established. But the problem with that is a gravel track. It's a gravel path to the wheelchair ramp. Also, there's nobody in this house that needs a wheelchair. But it can't be signed off. But as soon as it's signed off, you can then remove it.
Right. That's bizarre.
Yeah.
Yeah, I came across some similar stuff in the US. So I went to visit someone in Austin who was who was about to buy a house and having the house built. And they were just waiting for someone to come in and put in flooring. They were going to put in their own flooring, like entirely from scratch. And I said, why are you doing this? And they said, well, because the house has to be sold in a completed form before it can be signed off, before they can get a loan for it, all these things. So they're just having to do all of this extra work. And then the plan is to remove it entirely and then start it again. So there's lots of these regulations that do add all of these costs and push house prices up, and it's quite bizarre. I'd be interested to know why this particular house has to have a wheelchair ramp.
No, they all do. I think they all do now.
Due to size?
I think
any new
know.
house? Or?
I have no idea. All I know is for this house that it had to have a wheelchair access. I think it's because there's a step in front of the.
Yeah.
Most houses don't have a step. Even if you get up that ramp up that step, you still got to go over the step into the house. but I think it might be because the house has a step in front of the front door, so it has to exist. But that is a broad regulation. Whatever the regulation is, it's not because that exists. But like I say, you can remove it afterwards. There's no law that says I have to keep it.
Yeah.
The whole thing is absolutely ridiculous because that's just one example. There's so many with this house. Like, it's just with new build, and I think that's the problem. When you build big government, you create a lot of jobs for people to have to create rules and enforce those rules. If you reduce the size of government, you're gonna have to get rid of a lot of those fucking stupid rules.
Yeah, it's
what you're advocating for.
All of these policies often have the opposite impact, and that's why we're advocating for what we're advocating. And I mentioned Prospera at the beginning. This is an area, for example, where they don't have any of these prescriptions around what you can and can't build. They don't have prescriptions around things having to be in a certain predefined way in order to be sold and put on the market. They're using like modular housing, for example. So this means that you can just build one unit of a house and have parts of the house where extra areas can be added on at a later time if you want them to. And this is... It looks nice and neat, and it's also quite cheap to do and produces a really nice aesthetic. So this is the kind of thing that's possible in free cities, but unfortunately we have a different system which adds to costs and creates problems in most parts of the world.